I grew up in Albany, New York, in a small apartment that never really felt like home. My mother died when I was just 11, and from that moment on, it was only me and my father. But my father was no protector. He drowned himself in alcohol, every night stumbling through the door with a bottle in his hand, every morning promising me he'd stop, and every afternoon breaking that promise again. I learned to cook, to clean, to take care of myself because he couldn't. The neighbors pitied me. Teachers shook their heads, but no one could change the fact that I was the daughter of a man who lived more in the bottom of a glass than in reality. I carried that childhood like a heavy weight on my back, but I told myself I'd never let it define me. I studied hard, applied to nursing school, and when I finally graduated and walked into Albany Medical Center in my white uniform, I felt, for the first time, that my life might be my own. That was where I met Jonathan Mitchell. He was rushed into the hospital one night with severe abdominal pain. I was the nurse assigned to his care after his emergency appendectomy. He woke up groggy, blinking under the harsh hospital lights, and the first face he saw was mine. For days after the surgery, he would wander to the nurse's station under the pretense of needing water or medication. But really, he just wanted to talk. I listened as he told me about his work in finance, his ambitions, and how he had always lived with his mother, Eleanor, after his father's death. He seemed polished, kind, dependable, the complete opposite of the chaos I'd grown up with. When he asked me out, I was hesitant, but Jonathan had a way of making me feel safe, like maybe my past didn't matter. Within a year, we were married. There was no lavish ceremony, no grand reception. We signed the papers at City Hall, had dinner with a few of his colleagues, and that was it. For me, it was enough. I was finally someone's wife, finally not alone. But the truth I hadn't wanted to face was waiting for me in Jonathan's home. His mother, Eleanor Mitchell, was a woman carved out of ice. From the moment I stepped through her door, carrying my small suitcase and wearing what I thought was a hopeful smile, she looked me up and down with thinly veiled disdain. She had wanted a different wife for her son, someone with pedigree, someone worthy of the Mitchell name, not a nurse who grew up with a drunk for a father. I told myself I could win her over. I cooked, I cleaned, I respected her routines. But Eleanor's eyes lingered on me with quiet judgment, and her words cut sharper than knives. When months passed, and I didn't become pregnant, her comments turned cruel. "A family without children isn't a family at all," she'd whisper loud enough for me to hear. Jonathan would tell me to ignore her, that she didn't mean it, but he never once stood up to her. He was her only son, bound to her by a lifetime of guilt and obligation. Our apartment became a battlefield disguised as a home. I tiptoed around Eleanor's moods, tried to hold on to Jonathan's affection, and told myself things would get better. But every day I felt the walls closing in. Every night I lay awake beside a husband who couldn't, or wouldn't, choose me over his mother. I was no longer the girl who dreamed of saving lives in a hospital. I was just a woman trapped, suffocating in a marriage that was already beginning to crack. Living under the same roof with Eleanor was like sharing space with a storm cloud, always ready to break open, always ready to drench me in her disapproval. At first, she masked her disdain with polite remarks, but it didn't take long before the mask slipped. She reminded me constantly of where I came from, how my father was nothing but a drunk, how no one from my kind of background ever amounted to much. "Jonathan deserved better," she would say, not even bothering to lower her voice. What hurt most wasn't her words, it was Jonathan's silence. He would sit at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee, pretending not to hear. Later, when we were alone, he'd whisper, "She doesn't mean it. You know how she is." But he never told her to stop. He never defended me. His love was real, I believed that, but his loyalty to his mother was stronger. And every time he chose not to speak, a small part of me broke away. As the months turned into years, Eleanor's accusations grew sharper. My inability to get pregnant became her favorite weapon. She would shake her head as I passed in the hallway, muttering, "A barren wife is no wife at all." When neighbors came over, She would sigh dramatically and say, "Still no children," as if I wasn't standing right there. Jonathan would force a smile, change the subject, but the damage was already done. Our marriage began to shift in ways I couldn't stop. Jonathan started working later hours, or so he claimed. When he came home, he was too tired to talk, too tired to listen. The warmth that once lived between us was cooling, fading into something more like polite coexistence. I tried to hold on to him, to the man I had fallen in love with in that hospital room, but he was slipping further from me with each passing day. The apartment itself felt smaller and smaller. Eleanor controlled everything, from what meals were cooked to how the furniture was arranged. She insisted on handling the bills, the groceries, even what curtains hung in our bedroom. I had no space of my own, no corner where I could breathe freely. Even in the kitchen, if I tried to prepare dinner, she would hover at my shoulder, criticizing every move. Too much salt, too much oil. No wonder you can't give my son a child. You can't even cook properly. I began to withdraw, moving like a ghost through that two-bedroom apartment. At work, I felt useful, capable, respected. But the moment I stepped through our front door, it was as if I became invisible, nothing more than an unwelcome guest in my own marriage. Jonathan tried, in his way, to soften the blows. He'd bring me flowers occasionally or take me out for a walk around Washington Park. Those brief moments gave me hope, but the moment we returned home, the spell broke. Eleanor would be waiting, her sharp eyes flicking between us, and Jonathan would retreat into the shell of a dutiful son. Love alone wasn't enough to save us. I realized that too late. Our marriage was no longer built on partnership or dreams. It was held together by habit, by silence, and by my desperate hope that something would change. But every night, lying awake in that suffocating apartment, I knew the truth. I was living in someone else's home, under someone else's rules, with a husband who couldn't stand up for me. I was married, yet utterly alone. Our 5th wedding anniversary arrived in early spring. For once, Jonathan seemed determined to make the evening special. He reserved a table at one of the finest restaurants in downtown Albany, a place we had only ever admired from the outside. When we walked through its tall glass doors, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he wanted to remind me of the love that had brought us together in the first place. The chandeliers glowed softly, casting a golden light over polished tables and crisp white linens. A string quartet played in the corner, their music weaving through the low hum of conversation. Jonathan took my hand, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "Tonight is for us," he said, pulling out my chair. My heart lifted. For the first time in months, I felt like his wife, not just a shadow trailing behind him. I didn't know, of course, that Eleanor had already laid her plans. She had somehow discovered where Jonathan had booked the reservation, and through her network of friends, she had reached out to Stephanie Blake, his first love, the girl from his school days. I had no idea that Eleanor still believed Stephanie was the one woman truly meant for her son. When Stephanie walked into the restaurant, I didn't notice her right away. I was too busy enjoying the rare warmth in Jonathan's eyes as he poured me a glass of champagne. But I saw his expression shift. His hand trembled slightly as he set down the bottle, his gaze drawn toward the entrance. I turned my head just in time to see a woman glide across the floor with the kind of confidence only some women are born with. She was striking, tall, impeccably dressed, her every step commanding attention. I smiled politely, assuming she was just another diner, but Jonathan's face told me otherwise. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked on her like a man seeing a ghost from his past. He quickly looked away when I glanced back at him, forcing a smile, raising his glass as though nothing had happened. I remained blissfully unaware of who she was. To me, it was still a beautiful evening. We danced to the quartet's music, my cheek resting against his shoulder, my heart swelling at the thought that maybe the tension at home could be mended. I didn't see how distracted he was, how his eyes occasionally flickered across the room when he thought I wasn't looking. But Jonathan knew. He recognized Stephanie instantly. Years had passed since she had left him, chasing wealth and status with an older man. Yet seeing her now reignited something dangerous inside him. The pain of betrayal he had once carried seemed to melt under the heat of longing. She was no longer just the memory of a girl who had abandoned him. She was flesh and blood, standing a few tables away, more alluring than ever. I laughed, sipping my champagne, telling him stories about patients at the hospital, about small hopes for the future. He nodded, but I could sense his mind was elsewhere, though I didn't know where. My heart was light that night, but his was already beginning to wander. As we left the restaurant, Jonathan held me close, suggesting we stop by the apartment we occasionally used when we needed space from his mother. I agreed, believing it was his way of keeping the evening alive. I didn't realize that the spark I felt was not the same one burning in his chest. Mine was hope. His was the fire of a past love rekindled. That night, I went to sleep with a smile, certain we had taken a step back toward each other. Jonathan lay beside me in silence, his eyes open in the dark, haunted not by me, but by Stephanie Blake. After that anniversary night, I noticed subtle changes in Jonathan. He started working later, slipping out of the apartment with vague excuses about urgent meetings or last-minute deadlines. His phone was suddenly always on silent, tucked away in his jacket pocket, and if I reached for it, he grew tense. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. Every marriage has its rough patches, I told myself. But the truth gnawed at me quietly night after night. I felt the distance between us growing. The warmth in his touch had cooled, replaced by an almost mechanical politeness. In the mornings, he kissed my cheek as he left for work, but his lips felt cold, his eyes distracted. At dinner, he would barely speak, lost in some world I couldn't reach. When I asked him directly, he would sigh and say, "It's just the pressure at the office, Anna. Don't worry." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But small signs betrayed him. A faint trace of perfume that wasn't mine lingering on his shirt. A restaurant receipt stuffed into his pocket for a place we had never gone together. His habit of showering the moment he returned home, even if it was late. My heart told me the truth, but my mind fought it. I wasn't ready to admit that the man I had built my life around might already be slipping into someone else's arms. One evening, Jonathan told me he had to stay overnight at the office to prepare for an important presentation. Something in his voice didn't sit right with me. I waited until it was dark, then decided I couldn't ignore the doubts anymore. I called a cab and asked the driver to take me to the office building. The guard at the front desk looked at me with confusion. "All the employees left hours ago, ma'am. The building's been closed since 8. My stomach turned. I gave the driver another address, the small apartment Jonathan sometimes used when he worked late. He had always told me it was for convenience, a quiet place to rest when the long hours became too much. But as I approached the building, I saw lights glowing warmly in the windows. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I reached the door, I hesitated only a moment before knocking. From inside, I heard laughter, a woman's laughter, light and confident. Then Jonathan's voice, low and familiar, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. The door opened and there she was, Stephanie Blake. She stood before me wearing one of Jonathan's shirts, buttoned carelessly, her hair tousled, her eyes shining with triumph. Behind her, Jonathan appeared, barefoot, his hair damp as if he had just stepped out of the shower. The sight nearly buckled my knees. I had never felt pain so sharp, so absolute. I couldn't speak. I simply handed Jonathan the grocery bag I had brought, more out of instinct than reason. The silence between us was louder than any scream. And then, as if the moment weren't cruel enough, another voice cut through the air. Eleanor. She emerged from the hallway, her face calm, almost smug. "Now you understand," she said coldly. "My son has finally found the woman who can give this family a child. Stephanie has been the right one for him all along. You were never meant to stay." The world tilted beneath me. My throat burned, but no words came. I turned, walked back down those stairs, and somehow found my way to the street. The night air felt heavy, pressing in on me, suffocating. I didn't even remember how I got home. All I knew was that something inside me had shattered beyond repair. The divorce was swift and almost clinical. Because Jonathan and I had no children, there was little to fight over. He came to the courthouse alone, without Stephanie at his side, and signed the papers as if he were finalizing a business deal. I didn't shed a tear in front of him. My pain had already dried into something harder, something colder. By the time I walked out of that building with my name restored, I was no longer his wife, just a woman discarded, forgotten. I packed what little I owned and moved back in with my father. The apartment hadn't changed much since I was a child. Empty bottles cluttered the kitchen counter, the air thick with the sour smell of stale alcohol. He barely looked up when I arrived, only grunted, so it didn't work out. Figures. His words stung, but I was too tired to fight. I told myself I'd stay only until I found a way forward. But then his health began to spiral. Years of drinking caught up with him, and one night he collapsed on the bathroom floor. Somehow, with shaking hands, I managed to get him to the hospital. I pleaded with the doctors to do everything they could. Watching him hooked up to 4 lines, pale and trembling, I remembered the little girl I had once been, the one who had longed for a father who cared. And now here he was, broken by the life he chose, and I was the only one left to care for him. I juggled my shifts at the hospital with visits to his ward, snatching moments of sleep on hard plastic chairs. It was exhausting, but I couldn't abandon him, no matter how much he had abandoned me throughout my life. When a fellow nurse, Valentina, told me he was showing signs of improvement, I felt relief for the first time in weeks. Maybe things were turning around. But fate wasn't finished with me yet. A new supervisor had taken over the nursing staff, a man who seemed determined to clear out anyone who wasn't loyal to him. He scrutinized every move we made, waiting for mistakes. One night, after a long shift, a colleague I barely knew asked me to cover her tasks while she took an extended break. I didn't think much of it until the next morning, when controlled narcotics were found missing. The pills were discovered in my locker. I knew instantly I had been set up. My protests fell on deaf ears. The supervisor called me into his office, his expression already hardened with judgment. "You can resign quietly," he said, "or we'll have to escalate this formally." I sat there, numb, realizing that fighting would only smear my name further. With trembling hands, I signed the resignation papers. When I walked out of that hospital for the last time, it felt as though the world had turned its back on me completely. I had lost my husband, my home, my reputation, and now my career. Even my father, who had been discharged, showed me no gratitude. He grumbled about the food I cooked, cursed when I tried to limit his drinking, and told me more than once that I was a burden. One evening, as he shouted at me from the living room, I stood by the window and stared at the city lights. Albany no longer felt like a place I could survive. Everywhere I turned, I was haunted by ghosts of a marriage that had crumbled, of a career torn away, of a family that had never truly been mine. And so I made the only decision left. I would leave. I didn't know exactly where I would go, but I knew I couldn't stay. With nothing but a small suitcase and the faintest thread of hope, I walked out of my father's apartment, out of Albany, and out of the life that had already cost me everything. I left Albany with no clear plan, only the conviction that I couldn't keep suffocating in the ruins of my old life. My mother had grown up near Burlington, Vermont, and I remembered faint stories she had told me as a child about a quiet house surrounded by trees, a place where she and her sister used to play. With nowhere else to go, I boarded a bus heading north, clutching a single suitcase as if it contained not only my belongings but the last pieces of myself. When I finally arrived, the little house that had once belonged to my mother was almost unrecognizable. The roof sagged in places, The porch leaned dangerously to one side, and weeds had swallowed the yard. I walked up the steps, which groaned under my weight, and pushed open the door. Dust swirled in the sunlight, settling on broken furniture and warped floorboards. The house smelled of damp wood and abandonment. My heart sank. I had imagined it might be run down, but this felt closer to collapse than to shelter. I sat on the porch steps, burying my face in my hands. For the first time since leaving Albany, tears came, hot and unstoppable. I felt small and helpless, as if I had traded one prison for another. "Are you all right, dear?" a gentle voice called. I looked up and saw an older woman standing at the edge of the yard. She wore a simple cardigan, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her eyes filled with concern. That was how I met Harriet Collins, my mother's old neighbor. She told me she had recognized me immediately. "You're Veronica's girl, aren't you? You look just like her." Her words wrapped around me like a blanket I hadn't known I needed. When I explained that the house was falling apart and I had nowhere else to stay, Harriet didn't hesitate. "Come with me. I live just across the road. I've got space and I could use the company." Her home was warm and modest, filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and lavender soap. She showed me to a small guest room, neatly made up as if she had been expecting me all along. That night, lying in the soft bed, I felt safer than I had in years. Days turned into weeks. I started helping Harriet around the house, feeding her chickens, tending her small garden, carrying groceries. In return, she shared with me the quiet rhythm of country life. For the first time in years, I woke up to birdsong instead of shouting, to the smell of fresh air instead of stale alcohol. I found a part-time job at a small general store in town. The work was simple, stocking shelves, ringing up customers. But it gave me purpose, a reason to get up each morning. The townspeople quickly learned my name, greeting me with smiles, treating me not as an outsider, but as one of their own. In the evenings, Harriet and I would sit on her porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped behind the hills. She told me stories of her youth, of her late husband, of the son she rarely spoke to. And in return, I told her pieces of my own story, though I spared her the ugliest details. Slowly, she became more than a neighbor. She became a mother I thought I had lost forever. Sometimes, when she reached over to pat my hand, she would say softly, "You're the daughter I never had." And for the first time in a long time, I believed I might still deserve love, even if it came in forms I hadn't expected. The winter was hard on Harriet. She had always been strong, bustling about her little house with quiet determination, but I could see her strength fading. By late January, she spent more time in bed than out of it. I did everything I could, cooked, cleaned, sat by her side, but deep down I knew she was slipping away. One cold February morning, she called me into her room. Her voice was faint, her hand trembling as it reached for mine. "Anna," she whispered, "I don't want you to be alone. The house across the road, it should be yours. I've already put it in writing." Tears blurred my vision. "Harriet, please don't talk like that." She gave me a soft smile, the kind that made her eyes glow despite her frailty. "You've been the daughter I never had. This way, I'll know you'll always have a place to belong." A week later, she was gone. The house felt unbearably quiet without her voice, without the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floors. The townspeople came together for her memorial service, filling the little church on the hill with flowers and hymns. I stood by the casket, my hands folded, feeling as though I had lost my mother all over again. That was the day I met Thomas Green, Harriet's only son. He arrived late in the night before the service, his face pale from travel and grief. When he introduced himself, his handshake was firm, but his eyes were red-rimmed, carrying the weight of years spent apart from his mother. "I should have come sooner," he murmured after the service, his voice breaking. "I wasted too much time." I told him about Harriet's final days, how she had spoken of him often, how she had never stopped loving him. His shoulders trembled, and for a moment he looked like a little boy lost. In that moment, I understood his regret as if it were my own. Over the following days, Thomas stayed in town to handle his mother's affairs. We found ourselves talking often, sometimes for hours. He asked me about my life, and though I didn't share every painful detail, I told him enough for him to understand that I, too, carried scars. He didn't pity me, he simply listened, and in his quiet presence, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. One afternoon, as we stood outside Harriet's house, Thomas looked toward the sagging roof of my mother's old place across the road. "It could be beautiful again," he said, "with some work." I laughed softly. "It's more ruin than home." "Then let me help you," he replied simply. True to his word, Thomas rolled up his sleeves and set to work. Together, we cleared the yard, patched the roof, and scrubbed the dust and mold from the walls. With every nail hammered, every board repaired, the house began to feel less like a relic of my broken past and more like a foundation for something new. But it wasn't just the house that was being rebuilt. It was me, working alongside Thomas, sharing meals after long days of labor. I felt warmth stirring inside me, something fragile but undeniable. His presence was steady, dependable, and kind. There were no sharp words, no silent judgments, no cold silences. Just quiet understanding and a companionship that grew into something more with each passing day. Sometimes, as the evening light poured through the freshly cleaned windows, I caught him watching me, his eyes gentle, almost protective. And though neither of us spoke the words aloud, I knew. Love was beginning to bloom again, right there among the broken boards and the scent of fresh paint. By the time spring came, the little house was beginning to look alive again. Thomas and I had planted flowers along the porch, their colors bright against the weathered wood, and every evening we sat on the steps, watching the sun sink behind the Vermont hills. For the first time in years, peace felt possible, but peace never lasts forever. One afternoon, as I returned from the store, I saw a car I didn't recognize parked near the gate. Standing in the yard was Eleanor Mitchell. Her posture was stiff, her eyes sharper than ever, though behind them I glimpsed something I had never seen before: desperation. "Anna," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "please, we need to talk." I wanted to turn away, to walk inside and shut the door, but something in her tone made me pause. I crossed my arms and waited. "It's Jonathan," she began, wringing her hands. "He's lost his job. He owes money to people I can't even name. And Stephanie, she's left him. He's broken, Anna. He needs help. He needs you." For a moment, the words hung in the air, almost absurd in their audacity. After everything she had done, after she had stood in front of me and declared I wasn't worthy, after she had handed me over to humiliation and pain, she wanted me to save her son. I shook my head slowly. "No, Eleanor. He made his choice. He wanted Stephanie, and he wanted the life that came with her. Now he has to live with the consequences." Her lips trembled, but she pressed on. "You loved him once. Doesn't that mean anything?" "It means I know who he truly is," I replied coldly. "And that's exactly why I'll never go back." Her face hardened, the brief glimpse of weakness disappearing. Without another word, she turned and walked to her car, her heels crunching on the gravel like the closing of a door that should have never reopened. I thought that was the end of it, but a week later, Jonathan himself appeared. I was in the garden, kneeling among the rows of new seedlings, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, thinner, his face lined with exhaustion, his suit worn and ill-fitting. "Anna," he said, his voice raw. "Please, I need you." The sound of his voice once would have melted me. Now it only stirred the ashes of a fire long burned out. I rose slowly, brushing dirt from my hands. "You don't get to say my name like that anymore," I answered. He stepped closer, his eyes glistening. "I was wrong. Stephanie, she used me. She left the moment things got hard. You were the one who stood by me. You were the one I should have chosen. Please, just give me another chance." Before I could respond, Thomas came out of the house. He placed himself at my side, his presence steady and unyielding. His hand brushed lightly against my back, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. "You've said enough," Thomas told him firmly. "Anna doesn't owe you anything. Not after what you did." Jonathan's eyes darted between us, full of something like regret, but also envy. "So this is it? You replace me just like that?" I met his gaze and spoke, clearly. "You replaced yourself the night you chose her over me. Now leave." Thomas stepped forward, his voice low but sharp. "You heard her. Go." Jonathan lingered for a moment, his shoulders slumping, before finally turning away. As he walked down the path, I felt the last remnants of his hold on me dissolve. Thomas slipped his arm around me, pulling me close. "He's not your story anymore," he said softly. And he was right. Jonathan had been a chapter of pain, but that chapter was finally closed. The months after Jonathan's final visit unfolded like the slow bloom of spring. With him gone, a shadow lifted, and for the first time in years, I felt free to breathe. Thomas and I grew closer with every passing day, our bond forged not in fleeting passion, but in quiet trust, in steady companionship. When he asked me to marry him, it wasn't under chandeliers or in some grand display. He simply took my hand one evening as we sat on the porch, the Vermont sky awash in pink and gold, and said, "Anna, I want to build a life with you. Will you?" Tears filled my eyes as I whispered yes. It wasn't the kind of proposal little girls dream of, but it was exactly what my heart had always needed. Honesty, steadiness, love without conditions. Our wedding was small, held in the local church with the townspeople gathered like family. There were no expensive gowns, no elaborate decorations, just laughter, music, and a simple meal shared afterward in the community hall. As I stood across from Thomas, his hands warm in mine, I felt Harriet's presence as surely as if she were sitting among the guests. In my heart, I could hear her voice. "You'll always have a place to belong." Life in Burlington became a tapestry of simple joys. Thomas worked as a carpenter, his hands steady and skilled as he repaired not just our home, but others as well. I returned to nursing, this time in a small clinic where I wasn't just another face on a crowded roster, but part of a community that valued me. Neighbors stopped by with fresh bread, jars of honey, or simply to talk. For the first time, I felt rooted, like I wasn't just passing through life, but actually living it. When our first child was born, a baby boy with Thomas's eyes and my hair, I thought my heart might burst. Holding him against my chest, I knew the years of pain, betrayal, and loneliness had led me to this moment. I wasn't just a wife or a mother. I was whole again. Thomas often came home covered in sawdust, scooping our son into his arms with a laugh that echoed through the house. At night, after the baby was asleep, we would sit together on the porch, watching the fireflies flicker in the fields. He would rest his arm around my shoulders, and I would lean into him, grateful for the peace we had built. The community embraced us, too. At town gatherings, I was no longer the stranger from Albany, but Anna Green, Thomas's wife, the nurse who helped deliver babies and comforted families through illness. People knew my name, and they spoke it with warmth. That belonging I had once longed for, I finally found, not in the family I had married into, but in the one I had chosen and built. One evening, after putting our baby to sleep, I stepped onto the porch alone. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke. I sat in the rocking chair, cradling my son in my arms, his tiny breath steady against my chest. As I gazed at the stars, my mind drifted to Harriet. Without her kindness, I would never have had the strength to stay in Vermont, never have found Thomas, never have known this peace. She had been the mother I needed at the moment I was most lost, and her gift, the little house across the road, had been more than shelter. It had been the foundation of a new life. I bent my head, whispering softly so only the night could hear, "Thank you, Harriet. You changed everything." And as my son stirred gently in his sleep, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my heart. My story was no longer one of betrayal and loss. It was one of resilience, love, and the kind of family that lasts, not because of blood, but because of choice.